You're listening to the Lou Stokes Podcast. Real and inspiring conversations with individuals from all over the world, sharing their insights on sustainability, fashion, conscious consumerism, and empowerment. Be inspired to take action and be the change you want to see in the world. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Lou Stokes Podcast. Today on the show, I'm very lucky to have Mira Mikosic. Welcome, Mira. Thank you so much for coming on to chat with me today. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, and it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mira. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, give a bit of your background, and then we can talk about your own kind of personal fashion, sustainable fashion journey, and go from there.
Excellent. And I think I'm kind of not unique in the way that I'm part of this global community of people that probably 5 or 6 years ago, for 2017, it was me. I kind of had this awakening, for want of a better word, but it's almost coming full 360. And I'll start with, I was actually born in Croatia, and I come from generations really of farmers who lived very sustainably, who understood the importance of soil and land management. And really, the other piece I think that links to fashion, which is really dear to my heart, is the fact that I come from generations of females, which you would understand, Lou. Coming from Europe, there is such a historical legacy of this beautiful craftsmanship that's always been handed down from one generation to another. And this beautiful skill set that exists, in Asian communities as it does in European communities. So there were skills, sewing skills and knitting skills and all these skills that were passed down to me. And then when I was 5, like many families, my family migrated to Australia. And so I've lived in a very Western and very, very developed world culture. So my life really from then was and my career was very corporate led. So my career I've been very grateful to have a very international career and being able to lead business strategy, customer marketing, product and digital transformation, for many different sectors. So financial services through to hospitality, retail and technology. So I kind of feel I have been, and there's a lot of narrative in terms of, the donut economy now, as well as, degrowth and capitalist, and GDP and all these things. And I almost feel as though my career up until the last 6 years has been spent part of this very capitalist and industrialist engine. And, back in 2017, I basically I had just stepped out of an Asia Pacific role. And I think sometimes when we work in a particular industry, we almost become a little bit siloed. And It wasn't until I kind of stopped and I read some headlines around what was happening in the fashion sector. It's interesting when I hear other speakers now, they almost had the same epiphany around that, 2017 time, which I find really interesting. And for me, I felt as though I was living under a rock. How did I not know that this particular industry sector, who I've always had such an affinity with from a personal point of view in terms of fashion and, heritage and things, how did I not know how, the lack of transparency, the lack of, accountability that this sector had? And for me, coming out of very highly compliant industries, I just couldn't understand that. And, I think your podcast, and various guests document very well, all of the, there's so much systemically wrong. And I don't want to even use that word. It's a pathway that we got to. And I think there's so much opportunity going forward. And we just reached a tipping point where the current business model is just so broken from an end-to-end journey in terms of supply chain, whether you look at, the women who actually produce our clothing, and the slave labor and all the rest of them, the toxic chemicals and, there is so much and I'm sure we'll get into some of this, so I'm not going to belabor that. So So after I guess realizing what was happening there, my mother, when we migrated to Australia, she was a seamstress, so I had that affinity with and I remember also, um, my parents have both passed away in the last 5 years, but I always remember, mum's, this sense of pride that she could actually, as a female, contribute. And there's certain things, it's just my sister and I in the family, and there's certain things that she had such pride because of her work that she had done as an individual woman. That she could, we have beautiful dining sets that we still hold on to very dearly, and other things that, um, she was able. So I feel that women who actually work in the sector, um, and produce all these amazing clothes, we need to care for them and, celebrate the work that they do and the opportunity they have. So one of the other things which I'll close off, and one of the other things that alarmed me was also, we went kind of from very localized making of garments, and personalization of garments, and then we went to mass production, and mass production meant that we went to these large scale factories. But it's probably only 50 years ago, we had a very decentralized model. So and I don't know whether this happened in Europe, but, so I think we've all seen it where manufacturing has just been, sent offshore. So my analogy to that, working in large multinationals, organizations forever are looking for cost efficiencies, and that's okay. And sometimes they centralize, next team gets in, they decentralized. And a good example of this is when globally organizations decided to, send offshore all of their outbound and inbound call centers. And,
Yeah.
5 years later, a lot of them found that culturally it didn't work and they had to bring it in. So I feel as though we've almost reached that tipping point where we centralized and offshored too much, and we're kind of at that tipping point. And how do we rebalance it now in terms of going back to more local? And for me, I think what I've found in terms of even setting up our own business, and even I think of, Europe, a lot of offshoring was done in Europe, and sadly, what that meant, we've lost some of that local skill set. So even if we want to onshore the local skill set, we have to rebuild that skill
Yeah,
set locally. So, and I'm
absolutely.
going off on a tangent because this topic I could talk on forever and ever, and I know every guest kind of says that. But so for me, it led me to think, my gosh, if I'm going to actually do something in this sector, I don't want to actually just do something to solve for part of it. I want to solve the whole lot. So coming from a systems point of view, and I know that sounds absolutely crazy, and I know, there's some wonderful work being done in terms of, and I've worked with and supported organizations who are doing, rental, and have done wonderful things with rental, who've done wonderful things with resale. So I don't want to take away from those. But for me, it was kind of, well, that's all well and good, but the challenge is I need to actually solve the root cause. I don't want to just clean up. And I heard a
Yeah,
wonderful, and do you know what I mean?
yeah,
There was a
absolutely.
wonderful analogy, and it was by one of, who you would know well, by one of Ellen MacArthur's team from Circular Economy, and who gave the analogy of relating to fast fashion was, well, in the scenario where you actually have, you know, a bathroom, the bathtub's overflowing with water, what do you grab first? Do you grab a mop and start mopping, or do you actually go and tape it down, and solve it at the root cause? And I feel
Yeah,
as though with fast fashion, there's all these wonderful startups who are getting out their mops and doing as much as they can with their mops, but until we turn the tap down, there's
mm,
just no way. All these wonderful startups, and it doesn't matter how many of them, we just won't be able to keep pace, if that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a lot of like I always often think to myself, okay, what is the root cause? Because there's
Mm.
kind of all these layers to this root
Yes.
cause. It's not just one thing or one body or
Mm.
one system. It's like a network of things, and it's, you know, a mix of compliance and laws and regulations, mindset shifts,
Mm.
kind of stopping and reflecting rather than just chugging out all this stuff,
Yes.
just because, I mean, I obviously there's demand because people are buying, so brands keep chugging it out, but that's not an excuse.
Mm.
And I remember I talked with Katy about this. It's quite complicated because a lot of people say, well, the consumer needs to stop buying, but then the consumer doesn't have that much information. Like,
Mm.
we have information because we're constantly, you know, we're involved in all of
And
this. But
educating. Yeah.
exactly, but you know, just an average person that, you know, doesn't work in the industry and just, you know, goes about their daily life and goes and buys clothes, like, they often don't have much of an idea of what
Yeah.
goes on behind.
Mm.
And the same happened with the food industry. And then all of a sudden,
Exactly.
you know, shift of where, you know, what you're eating is actually, you know, vital, and that we've been eating, you know, all these different chemicals
Yes.
and things. And so, you know, I think as a society we're waking up, but there's a lot of work to do to
Oh,
unpick
and that's
this.
where I think you're absolutely right. I think there are so many wonderful, and a lot of the industry is starting to use the term actors. There are a lot of
Mm,
wonderful actors, and it definitely needs a systemic approach, and it definitely needs collaboration and all of these, you know, the regulators to do their part. Um, the owners who are producing, or the companies who are producing these products, just like any other industry, need to be accountable for.
yeah,
So, in the case, you know, for example, in the case of the financial services industry, there are industry bodies that actually regulate that, you know, we do the right thing, you know, from a consumer point of view. So, but you're right. I think what excites me the most is the fact that things have really accelerated, you know, versus 2017 when the community just wasn't out there. And I
yeah,
feel as though in the last, you know, especially the last 2 years, the awareness levels have and obviously COVID has had an element of accelerating that. But I also feel, you know, I'm excited to actually be speaking with you, and that there is this, you know, international cohort of people who are trying to, you know, educate and inform and just genuinely and authentically, you know, try to enable the movement, where, you know, the direction of where we need to go. And that's really inspiring because it kind of, there isn't that competition, and I don't think it's about competition anymore. And that kind of makes me really joyous and excited about that. And I'm glad you mentioned Katja. She actually just reminded me. I think she did a post yesterday, and she quite correctly ended up highlighting something that Olivia Firth said probably about 10 years ago, when she was on panel on and talking to H&M, and she talked about the fact that, you know, when we talk about responsibility in the consumer, and one of the things that Livia had highlighted was, well, you know, there are some analogies when you mention them to the food industry. You know, the fast fashion is a bit like sugar, you know,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's
and there is a
addictive.
wellness aspect to it, and that's part of what we try to communicate as a brand. I just think that the industry sector also needs to, beyond the toxins in terms of some that are within some of the fibers and the microplastics and so on. I think when it comes in the context of women, there is a mental health issue around there as well, and that's one of the things that we are hoping to. And it's not just mental health, it's also financial prosperity. So if you look at women, we know that they earn less, you know, there is that gap. But with the veracity of the need to continually be up with the trends, what that invariably means is that some of the stats around how much women spend on clothing versus men is something like, per year is around 230% more. Okay.
Wow.
Which once again impacts their longer term, financials as well, let alone what that does to, girls' mental health and with social media and everything. And for us, what our brand tries to also solve for is by creating clothing on demand as and when people need them in natural fibers. It eliminates the waste, but what it does, it makes clothing or fashion more accessible, because at the moment what we know also globally is that 50% or not 50% of women, in some cases depending on what stats you read, are actually excluded from accessing clothing because sizes stop at 12 to 14. And this, from a customer point of view, when I'm coming from very customer-led roles, before I ever launched a product, before I wanted to influence where the brand strategy went, it was always about, let's get into focus groups, let's get into qual studies, what's out there. I've sat through, across different countries and cultures, over 300, focus groups, really just trying to get in the headspace of what consumers need. And this is the interesting thing for me coming into this industry sector, and I think also an opportunity where the industry is so design-led and kind of top-down.
Yeah.
It's the only industry that really doesn't concern themselves with what the consumer may need or want. It operates almost on a buffet level. Well, here's the next buffet. Take from it what you want. If there's nothing there, doesn't matter. Wait around for the next one. So I feel that not many other industry sectors, apply it that way. And it's I find it a very transactional industry, because in the industry sectors where I've worked, it's about the largest cost in any business is to acquire a customer. Okay. And you always want to get your cost of acquisition down. And then there's this layer, once we have them, we want to nurture them across that customer journey. At every single touch point, we know that we are at risk of actually losing that customer, and we want to ensure that our brand is consistent in how we engage with. Yeah, well, this particular industry doesn't really look at customer in terms of their lifetime value. And I think that's an opportunity going forward. Just like, there's an opportunity to look at clothing in terms of the product lifetime value. So let's not just produce it once. What can we do to extend the life of that clothing? And in doing that, also extend the revenue that we might be able to derive from it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you find that with Simple Chic that consumers are open to this on-demand fashion concept?
Yeah, it's interesting. And this goes back to education. Women don't know where to go. So even in terms of repairing their clothes, and I remember how one particular lady, Eva, she was so joyous. She went out on her Facebook and said, I've got my mother's, she was actually from Germany. She went back to Germany and she got this beautiful old vintage dress from her mum, but she had to have it altered. And she was desperately trying to find someone who could actually do that for her via Facebook. And then she came across us. And I just find, oh my gosh, and I don't know whether it's different in Europe, but there is such a lack of knowledge of where to go. And one of the most popular things that, even to buy fabric here in Australia, people don't know where to go. And one of the most popular services that we have is around, and every woman in her wardrobe has 2 or 3 pieces that are her go-tos, that you wear them to death. and then you can never find them again. Or in some
Yeah.
cases, women buy 2 or 3 of them because they know that they'll never find them. So one of the most popular things that we have is women come back to us and say, I have this pair of pants, or I have this shirt or dress. Can you remake that for me? And can you remake it in this fabric? So I think there's so much education, I think, across the board, where people, 50 years ago used to have, just like we have our local hairdresser, where I'm going with this, people used to have their local, and once again, Olivia Firth, she talks about, and sometimes she posts about her seamstress down the road, who she adores, who she's known, just like she's known her, hairdresser for years, that she keeps going back to, and for her alterations, her upcycling, and so on. If I have a vision, our vision is to really reconnect women with other women who make their clothes, and just like we have any other relationship, and where there isn't this self-consciousness about this number and size and how my number and size fluctuates. Because I think if we get it right from the outset, and they have someone locally that they can connect with, and there isn't that shame associated with clothing, fashion is joyous. I've always, growing up, I've absolutely loved it. I've always wanted to find something unique, which is sometimes hard to do in a mass-produced
Yeah, absolutely.
style now. But
Not easy.
but I think I think we're going to get there, Lou. I just think it's taken us to now to really start to adopt and accept rental, to start to adopt and purchase and use clothing. So I think it's as kind of, I almost see it as a bit of a staged approach, because certainly we can't educate consumers on everything
No.
at the same time. So I think it's a journey.
Yeah.
And I think the infrastructure needs to be there, because, and I'll finish on the point of regulators. I think in the context of, if we are to support local industry, there are certain regulatory things that need to change. And in the context of Australia, I think only 5% of the clothing that we wear in Australia is actually produced locally. Okay, so we have 95% being imported in. And one of the biggest factors that has allowed that to flow through is the fact that, 20 years ago, tariffs were around, to import, were around, 20-25%.
Yeah.
Even in the last 5 years, they've been reduced to 5%.
Mm-hmm.
So there needs to also be things that, protect the consumer from, toxic things that they're going to be wearing. You need to have regulation that's going to, protect the local industry and help the local industry thrive again.
Yeah, absolutely. Because with all this importing, it's just killed, like we talked about before, all the local businesses, really.
Yes.
And like you said, restarting like that again. And, where are these seamstresses that, maybe some of them are not even here anymore. And so there's this new generation that doesn't really have much of an idea because they're more technological. So it's like, how do we cultivate this craft?
Yes.
So that we can then, build in our local communities and economies, and rather than relying on, on outsourcing or importing. Is that even with COVID, we realized that, like, oh, I can't get such and such now because it's coming from China. Yes. Or whatever. And so it's like, well, actually, maybe, maybe there's something wrong with what we've been doing all along, and going back to our grandparents who,
yes.
They probably had 10 items maybe of clothing, but all were very well made and by the seamstress, and they were, they didn't have this angst as well to have more. Because I think, like you said, with fast fashion being like sugar, it's like this addiction where you start and then you can't stop.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what you were just saying, Hello, Lou. I think I've lost you.
No, we're here.
Oh, and I think also what's happened is the era that you were mentioning, people actually valued their clothing and the whole art and the craft around it. And I always think about when you look back at the photographs of people in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, maybe not the 60s, but how immaculate does everyone look? Everyone looks absolutely unique and individual, and I'm not quite sure what we're going to say when we actually see some of the photos of the last 20 years. That would be interesting too.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, actually. I
Yeah.
hadn't thought about that.
But the other thing I think, which if you think of fashion is culture and art. It has so much history. And I feel as though with globalization and centralization of factories, and fashion's become vanilla.
Yeah.
I think we've lost that beautiful cultural overlay. So when I actually see other brands who are, recycling old embroidered tablecloths and making, a beautiful garments and dresses from that, and there is this product preciousness that's embedded, that has a new life again. So if I do have another wish in terms of the future, we can't lose the craft and the
No.
cultural richness, because I think of some of my favorite brands. You think of China, you think of silk. I think of Shanghai Tang, and I think of some of the beautiful suits that I had. There are some uniquely shaped and formed garments that are just, if I think of South America, my gosh, the richness of natural colors, and oh my gosh, it just brings a smile to my face when you see some of the women in the Andes and the craftsmanship and the weaving and the color. It's joyous. And I would love to, I'm all for merging of cultures, but how do you just integrate some of that craft and that culture into the new and the future without losing it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's vital that we do that as well, because we can't lose the essence of what design and fashion really are. And like you said, it is like vanilla. It's like everyone's kind of, I don't know, there's not personality to it anymore. There's not
Yes,
creativity. Well, there is in some ways, but in others there's not. And it's like people end up just looking at a magazine or Instagram and going, "Oh, I want that outfit," and
yes.
click. And,
And
and
I
it's
think
kind of,
there are certain influences probably that haven't helped, and which kind of makes me sad also, and each to their own. But you think of the Kim Kardashian effect. We don't want to all be lookalikes in terms of
no,
physical form, and I'm not even going to say anything about the new, nipple top and stuff like that. And I think some of these influencers and people who have an audience have such an opportunity, and when you don't, and you only see that used in terms of their own financial prosperity versus
yeah,
the broader opportunity. And I guess we all have our awakenings at different times, which is fine. But I think if we could have some of those key influences have a bit of an epiphany or an awakening, I think it would help our acceleration to where we want to go ultimately as well.
absolutely. Yeah,
Mm.
I agree with you there. It's like there's this opportunity for people to really use their platforms, even brands as well. They have,
Yes,
they have a lot of influence, and there's this huge opportunity for us to really, shift and change the way things are
mm.
being done. But yeah, I feel like give it a few more years maybe, and we'll see a
Yes,
completely different kind of, um, a different kind of way of doing things, especially with influences. influencers.
Absolutely. And I think just educators like you. I think of Katja doing her research. I think of Claire Press, who's been an amazing voice, who's
Yeah.
Australian and English. Cynthia, who I've spoken to recently, who you've spoken to, the wonderful work that she's leading. So I think there are these different people who are all looking at it, through a different lens, all of which is valued and trying to, support a different shift. So I think if we can continue to have some of these open conversations, and expand some of the roles that we can all have it. But it is, I think it's a staged journey, definitely. And I think what I'd love to start talking to, I think there are some cultures that are just still doing it right. I was recently listening to something else, actually by I think it was a UK lady speaking to a French model, and I actually worked for a Core Plus, a Core, so I would go to Paris, France, in the for over a 5-year period annually, and I obviously worked for a big global French company and American prior to that, but something that I didn't understand till actually just recently. And the conversation went something like this. So do French women go to the gym? And the response from the French model, her mum, I think, was French and her dad was English. And she goes, yes, of course they go to, the gym. And what do they wear to the gym? Oh, no, no. She said, no, the French women don't. They go to the gym, but they do not talk about going to the gym. So what do they wear? Well, do they wear their activewear? And the answer was no. They put on their activewear when they're at the gym and then they take it off and then they go. We're in Australia. Everyone is living in activewear. And I think it's so much synthetic. And I think, well, we could learn something from there. And then the conversation went, which I loved as well. And you think of, when we think of catwalks and we think of annual shows and seasonal shows, we think of, the runways in Paris and Milan. And what was interesting was when she talked about, well, the French women have their own sense of style. They do not follow trends. And I can see you nodding your head. And I think, oh my gosh, here's what we kind of see as the capital of the world. And here's women who actually live more true to themselves in terms of the fashion sense, and probably more sustainably, because it's about they've already defined their own style and what works for them, and are not on this fashion treadmill, and probably are not spending as much as other cultures are. So I thought that was really, really interesting, and I think there's something that we can take away from that. Because if I had a wish for any woman, I want her to feel comfortable in her own skin, and not to be worried about what she's wearing, and just to be, when you're wearing something that you don't have to adjust it, it fits beautifully, and it's just you don't actually think about what you're wearing. There is just this innate sense of confidence when you put it on, and it's like your power suit, because it is just this sense of feeling that it's innately you, and for some reason it's very comfortable. So I wish that for all women. I want them to feel comfortable in their own skin, and for them just to be able to find their own style journey without having this constant, oh my gosh, what others are feeling and saying publicly in media and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like Europe and is a bit more about their own style. I mean, obviously there's a lot of trend followers here, but I feel like people are very much more into their own personal style, especially now more than before. I think people have shifted a lot since COVID as well, in the way they think about their clothes and what they wear and what suits them, and they're not so caught up in trends. I think there is a shift with that as well. But it's interesting what you say about the French. It's like, what I find interesting is that, like, Paris is one of the, fashion capitals of the world, yet the French women are like, no, we do our own thing, you know, and it's like,
I
well,
love it.
yeah, that's like
I love
exactly
it.
what fashion is, you know. So it's like
Yes.
it's just ironic that it's people look at it like
And
that
I
when
don't know
really
whether many people, I don't know how many people actually know that. So I think there, and I think that's it. I think there are different things, which I've always, traveled a lot for work culturally, and um, I'm sure there is lessons from other cultures that we can actually just, take on board, as learning as we go through getting back to where we can't, what is the new sense of balance where, for
yeah,
all of us. Yeah.
absolutely. So Mira, just to finish off, what would you say your vision of the future is for fashion? I've lost. Oh, there you go. There you go. There you go. I can hear you now.
It probably falls into three categories, and the first I'm going to say has to be linked, to women, and the first one is, and this is, I guess, in terms of our vision, and our vision also in my long-term vision and what we're trying to create with Simple Chic as well, is number one, the the current model is broken in terms of these huge factories where people are just crammed in. So
Yeah.
I'd love for us to rebalance that, and for the women that we support, I see us supporting, and which is the only thing we do, is support independent women designers and makers in local communities. So those micro businesses, I'd love to see those thrive again, and they just don't get enough funding because the reality is, which is ironic for the women's apparel industry, 60% of the garments that are actually designed are designed by men, not by women. So women micro businesses don't have a chance to succeed given the current model. So we want to support those and reconnect the consumers with them so they actually have someone to go to. And what that does for us is two things, because we're creating and enabling and supporting employment opportunities for independent women designers and micro business. We want them to thrive, while at the same time, enabling them to support women, in terms of, creating clothing on demand that's relevant to them,
Yeah.
and what that does for people's mental health. And once that connection happens, then, it's a natural transition. Can you repair this for me? Or can you upcycle it? Can you remake it? Because I just can't find it anywhere. And I think what that does for the women consumers and their mental health, it saves time. This constant searching of trying to find something and just being able to quickly get to what you need. Um, so that, so we've got a very much a female-led model around how we want to support consumers and female micro businesses. The other piece is just natural fibers. I've grown up with natural fibers. My mother, before we migrated here, she actually grew hemp. She turned hemp into fiber, into sheets and other things. So I've always worn natural fibers. I was just alarmed, in 2017, how much, for us to be wearing 65% of our clothing now to be plastic, and we're wrapped in plastic, and the implications of that are just so alarming. So we partner for one of our product range, which is 100% merino wool, fully traceable to 30 farms back in New Zealand and Australia, and done all the right way. So natural fibers for the wellness of ourselves. My gosh. And this is what I find so annoying, Lou, when I think, addressed by if you go to Net-a-Porter or wherever you're going, $5,000, and they talk about you're paying $5,000 for design and you're buying plastic, and they don't even tell you it's plastic. So I think there's education in that. So natural fibers that are biodegradable. So whether they're existing natural fibers or this amazing array of new, fibers that are being produced from various things, would be the other piece. So no more natural fibers, no more microplastics, supporting women businesses and the end consumer. And by making everything on demand, we just eliminate all this waste, from the outset. So it's ambitious. I don't know whether the market's really ready for us yet, but I see that, technology from a design perspective will also be there. We've also created a tech tool where women can design their own clothing. So I feel just like, in Canva, the technology's there. So ambitious, but I think we need to have a vision and a destination to head to. Otherwise, we don't know where we're going.
Absolutely.
So I'm not afraid to be ambitious. And I know, with yourself and the whole global community, we're heading in a particular direction. And I think where we will get to will probably be even better than what we had imagined, which I'm sure of.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mira, so much for coming on. I've loved chatting to you. Please, can you tell our listeners where they can find you and your business?
No, thank you. Our website is simply simplechic.com. And people can also just find me on LinkedIn, Mira Mikosic. And I'm all about sustainability and just finishing up my GRI sustainability certification. So we love to support businesses in that area and are just going through our B Corp accreditation at the moment as well. So any other fashion businesses that we can support in the area of sustainability and supply chains, we'd be delighted to. Thank you, Lou.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mira. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please subscribe to the Lou Stokes Podcast. Rate and review in the Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're tuning in from. I'd be so grateful. Also, check out the show notes to learn more about my guests and learn more about me on my website, www.loustokes.com. Until next time, be inspired, take action, and be the change you want to see in the world.